My husband kept ignoring my feelings, so this time I learned how to disappear without leaving. Before everything changed, I believed silence in love was temporary, like weather that would eventually clear. I used to think that if I waited long enough, he would remember who I was to him. But somewhere between shared breakfasts and quiet nights, I realized that waiting had become my only role. When people ask how our distance began, I never know where to start. There was no single explosion, no dramatic betrayal, no obvious villain. There was only a gradual erosion, like water wearing down stone. He stopped noticing my voice. I stopped recognizing my reflection. In the beginning of our marriage, he had looked at me as if I were the center of his world. He listened to my stories with curiosity, touched my hand with intention, and treated my thoughts as if they mattered. Over time, his attention shifted toward work, friends, and endless distractions. I became a background presence in his life, reliable but invisible. I tried to talk to him about it. I chose my words carefully, afraid that honesty might sound like accusation. He always responded with impatience or confusion. He said he was tired, stressed, busy. He said I was overthinking. Sometimes he promised to do better, but his promises were like mist that disappeared before sunrise. I began to measure love by silence. When he didn't ask how my day had been, I told myself he was exhausted. When he forgot important moments, I told myself memory was fragile. When he looked through me instead of at me, I told myself I was imagining things. Each excuse protected him and slowly destroyed me. The moment that changed everything came quietly. One evening, I was sitting across from him at dinner, watching him scroll through his phone while I spoke. Halfway through my sentence, I realized he had not heard a single word. Something inside me went still. I felt no anger, no tears, no urge to fight. I felt a strange clarity, like a door closing without noise. After that night, I stopped demanding attention. I stopped explaining my feelings. I stopped trying to be seen. Instead, I became calm, polite, and distant. I treated him with courtesy rather than affection. I listened without attachment and responded without emotion. My silence was no longer desperate, it was deliberate. He noticed the change slowly. At first, he seemed relieved. I was easier to live with. I didn't complain or cry, I didn't interrupt his routines. But after a while, he started watching me the way people watch unfamiliar strangers. He asked if I was angry. I told him I wasn't. He asked if something was wrong. I told him everything was fine. One night, he confessed that he felt like he was losing me. I listened without reacting. He apologized for not paying attention, for dismissing my feelings, for taking me for granted. His voice trembled with fear. I watched him with quiet sadness, aware that the person he was trying to reach had already changed. For days after that conversation, he tried to rebuild what he had broken. He cooked dinner, asked questions, and offered affection. His efforts were sincere, but they arrived too late. I felt like someone watching a fire being extinguished after the house had already burned down. I wondered whether love could be revived once it had turned into ash. That was where our story paused, balanced between regret and distance, between memory and reality. And that was where my real journey began. The next morning, I woke before him. The sunlight slipped through the curtains and rested on his face, making him look younger and gentler than he had in months. For a moment, I felt a familiar ache in my chest. I remembered the man I had fallen in love with, the man who used to wake me with laughter and whispered jokes. I went to the kitchen and made coffee. While the kettle boiled, I studied my hands. They looked older than I felt. Tiny lines crossed my skin, traces of years spent waiting, forgiving, and hoping. I wondered how much of myself I had lost while trying to preserve us. When he joined me, he greeted me with unusual softness. "Good morning," he said, touching my shoulder. His hand lingered, uncertain. I smiled politely and stepped aside to pour coffee. He watched me carefully, as if my smallest movement carried meaning he was trying to decode. During breakfast, he asked about my plans for the day. I told him I had work and errands. He offered to drive me. I declined gently. He looked disappointed but didn't insist. I could feel his confusion growing, like a quiet storm gathering strength. On my way to work, I replayed our past in fragments. I remembered our first apartment, the cheap furniture, and the excitement of building a life together. I remembered how he used to listen to my dreams as if they were maps to a future he wanted to share. Somewhere along the way, those dreams had become invisible. At the office, I found it difficult to concentrate. My colleagues chatted about relationships and weekend plans, unaware that my inner world was collapsing and rebuilding at the same time. I smiled when required, answered emails, and attended meetings, but my thoughts kept returning to him and to the strange distance between us. That evening, I arrived home earlier than usual. The apartment was quiet. I heard the faint sound of music coming from the living room. When I entered, I saw him sitting on the couch, staring at an old photo album. He looked up when he noticed me, his expression caught between surprise and embarrassment. "I was just looking at our pictures," he said. "We used to look happy." I sat beside him without touching him. "We were," I replied honestly. He flipped through the pages slowly. Each photograph seemed to carry a memory he had forgotten, and was now rediscovering. He asked me about moments he could no longer recall. I answered calmly, describing events that felt both close and distant. As the evening passed, he began to ask deeper questions. "When did you stop loving me?" he asked quietly. I paused before answering. "I didn't stop loving you," I said. "I stopped feeling loved." He looked down, his fingers tightening around the album. "I didn't realize it was that bad." "That's the problem," I replied softly. "You didn't realize anything." After that conversation, something subtle shifted in our daily routine. He became more attentive, more careful with his words. He listened when I spoke, turned off his phone during meals, and tried to include me in his plans. Part of me appreciated his effort. Another part felt strangely detached, as if I were observing his behavior from a distance rather than participating in it. One weekend, he suggested that we take a short trip to the seaside town where we had once spent our honeymoon. He said we needed to reconnect, to remember who we had been. I hesitated, unsure whether revisiting the past would heal us or deepen the wound. Eventually, I agreed. The journey felt surreal. As we drove along familiar roads, memories resurfaced with painful clarity. He talked about our early years, laughing at old jokes and recalling small details. I listened quietly, feeling both nostalgia and grief. It was like walking through a museum dedicated to a version of us that no longer existed. When we arrived at the town, the air smelled of salt and nostalgia. We checked into the same small hotel where we had once celebrated our love. The receptionist recognized us and smiled warmly, unaware of the emotional distance between us. That evening, we walked along the beach in silence. The waves crashed rhythmically, echoing the tension in my chest. He stopped suddenly and turned toward me. "I'm scared," he admitted. "I feel like I woke up too late." I looked at him carefully. His fear was genuine. For the first time in years, he was vulnerable without defensiveness. "Being scared doesn't change what happened," I said. "It only shows that you finally see it." He asked if there was still a chance for us. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I stared at the horizon, watching the sky darken. I realized that my silence had become a language of its own, one he was only beginning to understand. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside him, listening to his breathing, thinking about the years I had spent waiting for him to notice me. I wondered whether love could survive awareness that arrived after neglect. I wondered whether forgiveness was possible without forgetting. The next day, we visited places that had once been meaningful to us. At a small cafe, he apologized again, this time without excuses. He admitted that he had taken my presence for granted because he believed I would always be there. His honesty was painful but refreshing. Listening to him, I felt something unexpected. Compassion mixed with exhaustion. I understood his flaws more clearly than ever before. I saw the insecurity behind his indifference, the fear behind his distraction. Yet understanding did not erase the scars. When we returned home, our relationship entered a fragile new phase. He continued to try, and I continued to respond with cautious politeness. Friends noticed the change. They commented on how calm I seemed, how composed our relationship looked from the outside. They didn't know that calmness was not peace, but distance. One evening, an old friend of his visited us. Watching them talk, I noticed how easily he laughed with her, how naturally he engaged in conversation. A familiar pain stirred inside me. I realized that his neglect had never been universal. It had been selective. That realization reopened wounds I thought had healed. After his friend left, I confronted him. I asked why he could be present with others but absent with me. He looked startled, then ashamed. He said he had never meant to hurt me, that he had simply assumed I didn't need the same attention as others. His words revealed a truth I had feared. He had mistaken my patience for emotional immunity. That night, I cried alone in the bathroom, not out of anger, but out of mourning for the woman I used to be. I realized that my revenge had never been about punishing him. It had been about protecting myself from disappearing entirely. Days turned into weeks, and our conversations grew deeper and more honest. We argued, confessed, and questioned each other. He admitted that he had been afraid of emotional intimacy, afraid of responsibility, afraid of failing me. I admitted that I had been afraid of losing him, afraid of confrontation, afraid of loneliness. Slowly, we began to rebuild our relationship on unfamiliar ground. This time, there were no illusions. We saw each other clearly, flaws and all. Sometimes the clarity hurt, but it also felt liberating. One night, during a particularly intense conversation, he asked me if I still wanted to be with him. The question hung between us like fragile glass. I searched my feelings carefully, afraid of lying to him or to myself. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I know I don't want to feel invisible anymore." He nodded slowly. "And I don't want to lose you because of my blindness." In that moment, I understood that love was not something we could return to. It was something we would have to reinvent or let go of completely. Over the following months, we made deliberate changes. We attended counseling, set boundaries, and learned to communicate without defensiveness. The process was painful and awkward, like learning to walk again after a long injury. Sometimes we failed, sometimes we succeeded. Always we were honest. During one counseling session, the therapist asked me why I had chosen silence instead of confrontation. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "Because silence was the only way he could finally hear me," I said. He looked at me with a mixture of regret and gratitude. In that moment, I felt a strange sense of closure. My revenge had not destroyed him, it had awakened him, but it had also changed me in ways I could not undo. Years later, when I look back at that period of our lives, I don't see villains or heroes. I see two flawed people who learned too late that love requires constant attention. I see a woman who almost disappeared and a man who almost lost her. Today, our relationship is different. It is not perfect, but it is conscious. He listens when I speak. I speak when I feel unheard. We no longer rely on silence to communicate pain. Instead, we face discomfort directly, even when it hurts. Sometimes, late at night, I still feel echoes of the old loneliness. When that happens, I remind myself that I am no longer invisible, not to him and not to myself. My silence is no longer a cry for attention. It is a choice, a boundary, a reminder of who I am. If there is one thing I learned from that journey, it is that revenge does not always look like destruction. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal, clarity, and self-preservation. Sometimes the most powerful act is not screaming, but stepping back and allowing someone to feel the absence they created. I no longer measure love by promises or apologies. I measure it by presence, by attention, by the willingness to see and be seen. And in that measure, I finally understand what I deserve. In the end, I did not destroy my marriage, nor did I save it alone. We saved it together, painfully and honestly, or perhaps we simply transformed it into something new and fragile and real. Whatever name it carries, it is no longer built on silence. When I remember the woman who once sat at the dinner table feeling invisible, I feel tenderness rather than shame. She was not weak. She was learning. And the silence she chose was not surrender. It was the beginning of her voice. After that realization, I began noticing details I had ignored for years. The way he hesitated before speaking, as if testing the weight of every sentence. The way he watched my face when he thought I wasn't looking, searching for signs he might lose me again. His fear was no longer abstract. It had become visible, almost tangible, and sometimes it frightened me more than his earlier indifference. One afternoon, I met my sister for coffee. She had watched my relationship from the outside and had never hesitated to question it. When I told her about the changes in my marriage, she listened quietly, then asked a question I had avoided. Do you still love him, or do you just feel responsible for what he's becoming? Her words stayed with me long after we left the cafe. That night, I confronted him again. Not with anger, but with brutal honesty. I told him I was afraid of staying in a relationship driven by guilt instead of love. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he admitted that guilt had indeed pushed him to change, but that somewhere along the way, fear had turned into genuine care. His confession was messy and imperfect, yet strangely sincere. Weeks later, a crisis tested us. He received an offer to relocate for work, a promotion he had dreamed of for years. The opportunity meant distance, uncertainty, and another shift in our fragile balance. He asked my opinion, but I sensed he was afraid of my answer. For the first time, he was willing to sacrifice ambition if it meant losing me. I surprised both of us by encouraging him to accept the offer. I told him that love should not demand self-erasure from either of us. If our relationship could survive distance and change, it deserved to exist. If it couldn't, forcing it to stay still would only postpone the inevitable. My words felt like a final test of everything we had learned. During the months that followed, we lived in different cities, connected by long conversations and deliberate effort. Distance exposed truths we could no longer hide. Sometimes we missed each other deeply. Sometimes we enjoyed the solitude too much. Slowly, we understood that love was not a guarantee, but a choice renewed every day. When he finally returned, we didn't celebrate with dramatic gestures. We sat together quietly, sharing ordinary stories, comfortable in a way we had never been before. There was no illusion that everything was fixed. Instead, there was acceptance of imperfection and respect for each other's inner worlds. Looking back, I realized that my silence had been both weapon and mirror. It forced him to confront his own emptiness and forced me to confront my fear of abandonment. Neither of us emerged unchanged. Yet, in the process, we learned something rare and painful. Love cannot survive without attention, and attention cannot exist without awareness. Today, when I hear couples complain about small misunderstandings, I smile sadly. I know how easily small neglects can grow into unbearable distances. I also know that sometimes distance is the only path back to truth. I am no longer afraid of disappearing, because I know how to find myself again. I am no longer afraid of losing him, because I understand that love based on fear is not love at all. What remains between us is not perfect, but it is honest. And for the first time, honesty feels more powerful than revenge. Sometimes I think about the quiet girl I used to be, and feel grateful she chose silence wisely. Without that painful pause, neither of us would have learned how fragile hearts are, or how courage often begins quietly, and how love must be protected daily.